When my grandma handed me the small, old-fashioned key and winked, I thought it was some quirky piece of family history, a keepsake passed down with a sentimental nod. Her eyes sparkled as if the key held a secret she couldn't wait to share. I took it without hesitation, feeling a sense of warmth and belonging, convinced it was a precious relic that would unlock memories of a bygone era. But as I searched for a lock it might fit, the reality dawned: no door I owned, no place I knew, could accommodate it. In the silence of my confusion, I realized that the key wasn't meant for any physical door. It was a symbol of hidden wisdom, unspoken truths, and the lessons my grandmother imparted with love. It wasn't the key to a place, but to an understanding of life, family, and the mysteries we must navigate alone. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Grandma Rose's living room, casting delicate patterns across the worn wooden floors that had witnessed decades of family gatherings. At 28, I'd grown accustomed to these weekly visits, but today felt different somehow. The air held a weight I couldn't quite name, thick with unspoken words and the scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to Grandma's sweaters. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that had been her throne for as long as I could remember, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite her 83 years. "Emma, dear," she said, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that had comforted me through scraped knees and broken hearts, "come sit with me for a moment." Her eyes, still bright behind wire-rimmed glasses, held something I'd never seen before, a mixture of urgency and mischief that made my heart skip. I settled onto the ottoman beside her chair, the same spot I'd occupied as a child when she'd tell me stories about her youth during the war, about my grandfather who'd passed before I was born, about the dreams she'd harbored as a young woman. The family had been through so much lately. My parents' divorce had finalized just 6 months ago, leaving everyone walking on eggshells around each other at family dinners. My younger brother Jake had been acting out, failing his college courses and refusing to talk to anyone about what was really bothering him. Even my usually composed mother seemed to be unraveling, throwing herself into work with a desperation that worried us all. Through it all, Grandma Rose had remained our anchor, the one constant in a family that suddenly felt like strangers living in the same story. "I've been thinking about what to give you," she continued, her weathered hands reaching into the pocket of her cardigan. "Not for any special occasion, mind you, but because sometimes the heart knows when it's time." She pulled out something small, her fingers closing around it protectively. "Your grandfather gave this to me many years ago, long before you were born. It's been waiting for the right moment, the right person." The weight of her words settled over me like a blanket, heavy with significance I couldn't yet understand. When she opened her palm, I saw a small, old-fashioned key, its bronze surface tarnished with age but still beautiful in its simplicity. The metal felt warm against my skin when she placed it in my hand, as if it had been absorbing her body heat for hours. The key was unlike anything I'd ever seen, ornate but not ostentatious, with delicate engravings that seemed to tell a story I couldn't read. It was roughly 3 inches long, with a round head decorated with tiny flowers and a shaft that ended in teeth worn smooth by time. "What does it open, Grandma?" I asked, turning the key over in my palm, feeling its weight and texture. Something about it felt alive, as if it pulsed with its own heartbeat. She smiled then, that enigmatic expression that had always made me feel like she knew secrets about the universe that the rest of us were still learning. Her eyes sparkled with a light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, a glow that made her look decades younger. "That's for you to discover, sweetheart," she said, reaching over to cup my face in her soft hands. "But I will tell you this, it's not what you think it is. This key has been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from woman to woman when the time is right. My grandmother gave it to me when I was about your age, struggling to find my place in the world after the war ended and life had to begin again." She paused, her thumb stroking my cheek gently. "And now it's your turn." The moment felt suspended in time, as if the universe had paused to witness this passing of something precious and mysterious. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what she meant about it not being what I thought, but something in her expression told me this was all she would reveal for now. Instead, I closed my fingers around the key and pulled her into a hug, breathing in that familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that had meant safety and love for as long as I could remember. As I drove home that evening, the key burning a hole in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my life. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it carried the gravity of generations within its small frame. When I finally made it to my apartment, I immediately began searching for what it might unlock. I tried every door, every drawer, every old jewelry box and antique chest I owned, but nothing fit. The key remained stubbornly mysterious, refusing to give up its secrets. That night, as I lay in bed with the key on my nightstand, I found myself staring at it in the dim light from the street lamp outside my window. Grandma's words echoed in my mind, "It's not what you think it is." What had she meant? And why had she looked at me with such intensity when she'd handed it over, as if she were passing on more than just a piece of metal? The questions swirled in my head as sleep eluded me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a turn toward something I wasn't prepared for, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The next morning brought no relief from my obsession with the key. I woke up groggy and disoriented, having spent most of the night tossing and turning with dreams of locked doors and hidden passages. Over breakfast, I found myself absent-mindedly turning the key over in my fingers, studying every detail of its intricate design. The tiny flowers etched into the metal seemed to shift and dance in the morning light, and I wondered if they meant something specific or if they were simply decorative flourishes from a bygone era. When I called my mother to ask about the key, her reaction was immediate and unsettling. "Emma, you need to put that thing away and forget about it," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Your grandmother shouldn't have given it to you. It's just going to cause problems." The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end. "Some things are better left buried, sweetheart. Trust me on this." Her words only fueled my curiosity. My mother had always been the practical one in our family, the voice of reason who approached problems with logic and efficiency. But there was something in her tone that suggested fear, or maybe resentment. When I pressed her for more information, she became evasive, changing the subject to my work and asking about my latest project at the marketing firm. But I could sense the underlying tension, the way she seemed to be holding her breath whenever I mentioned the key. That afternoon, I decided to visit my brother Jake at his campus apartment. If anyone would help me figure out this mystery, it would be him. We'd always been close, despite the 4-year age gap, and he had inherited our grandmother's love for puzzles and mysteries. I found him sprawled on his couch, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and textbooks he clearly hadn't opened in weeks. His hair was unkempt, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been having as much trouble sleeping as I had. "Hey, sis," he mumbled, not looking up from his phone. "What brings you to my palace of academic failure?" There was a bitterness in his voice that hadn't been there before the divorce, an edge that cut through his usual easygoing demeanor. I sat down beside him, carefully moving aside a pile of dirty laundry, and pulled out the key. "Grandma gave me this yesterday," I said, holding it up to catch the light streaming through his grimy window. "She said it's been in our family for 3 generations, but I can't figure out what it opens." Jake's expression changed immediately when he saw the key. The casual indifference melted away, replaced by something I'd never seen in his eyes before, recognition mixed with what looked like panic. "She actually gave it to you?" he whispered, sitting up straighter and reaching for the key with trembling fingers. "I thought Mom had hidden it away years ago. I haven't seen this since I was maybe 10 years old." He held it up to the light, examining it with the same intensity I'd been feeling. "I remember asking Grandma about it once, and she told me it would be passed down when the time was right. But Mom came in and took it away, said I was too young to understand." The pieces began clicking into place. "So you've seen this before? You know what it is?" I asked, leaning forward eagerly. Jake nodded slowly, his expression growing more troubled by the second. "Not exactly what it is, but I know what it represents. There's something in our family history that the adults have been keeping from us, Emma. Something that goes back generations." He stood up and began pacing around his small living room, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "Remember when we were kids and we'd visit Grandma's house? How there were always certain rooms we weren't allowed to go into. And how Mom and Grandma would sometimes have these intense, whispered conversations that would stop the moment we walked into the room? I nodded, remembering the mysterious atmosphere that had always seemed to surround certain family gatherings. I think this key is connected to whatever they've been hiding, Jake continued, his voice growing more animated. And I think that's why Mom freaked out when the divorce papers were finalized. She kept saying something about the family secrets coming out and how Dad never understood what he was getting into when he married into this family. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Our parents' divorce had seemed to come out of nowhere, with vague mentions of irreconcilable differences and growing apart. But what if there was more to it? What if our family had secrets that were toxic enough to destroy a 25-year marriage? I thought about my mother's reaction to the key, the fear in her voice when she'd told me to put it away and forget about it. Jake, what if this key is the reason our family is falling apart? I asked, voicing the terrible possibility that had been forming in my mind. What if whatever it represents is so damaging that it's been tearing us apart from the inside? My brother stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression of growing dread. There's only one way to find out, he said finally. We need to go back to Grandma's house and search for whatever this key opens. But we need to be careful, Emma. If Mom finds out what we're doing, she'll probably never speak to us again. The weight of that possibility settled over us both. Our family was already fractured, were we about to shatter it completely? That evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I tried to work on a client presentation, but my mind kept wandering to the key and the growing certainty that my entire family had been built on a foundation of lies. The key seemed to pulse with malevolent energy now, no longer the charming antique I'd initially thought it was. Instead, it felt like a weapon, something designed to destroy the carefully constructed world my mother had spent decades building. When I finally went to bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. Grandma Rose had given me the key with love and trust, but what if she hadn't fully understood the consequences? What if, in her advanced age, she'd forgotten why the key had been hidden in the first place? As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to open a door that had been locked for very good reasons, and once opened, it could never be closed again. The next Saturday morning, Jake and I stood outside Grandma Rose's house, both of us nervous about what we might discover. The Victorian home looked different in the pale morning light, less welcoming than it had during my usual visits. The wraparound porch that had always seemed charming now felt like a fortress, and the tall windows seemed to watch us with suspicious eyes. I clutched the key in my sweaty palm, feeling its weight as if it might drag me down into the earth. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We could just pretend this never happened. Go back to our normal lives and forget about the key." But even as he said it, I could see the same burning curiosity in his eyes that had been consuming me all week. We both knew there was no going back now. The questions had taken root too deeply, and the only way forward was through whatever truth lay waiting for us. Grandma Rose answered the door with her usual warm smile, but I noticed something different about her expression when she saw us both standing there. Her eyes flickered to my hand, where the key was partially visible, and for just a moment, her composure seemed to slip. "Emma, Jake, what a lovely surprise," she said, stepping aside to let us in. "Though I have to say, you both look like you've seen a ghost." The familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that had always comforted me now seemed cloying, too sweet, as if it were trying to mask something unpleasant underneath. We followed her into the living room, where she gestured for us to sit on the floral sofa that had been there since my childhood. But instead of settling into her usual armchair, she remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Grandma," I began, pulling out the key and holding it up, "Jake says he's seen this before. He says there are family secrets that have been kept from us. I need to know what this key opens." Her face went pale, and she sank into her chair as if her legs had suddenly given out. For a long moment, she stared at the key without speaking, her breathing shallow and rapid. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered finally, her voice so soft we had to lean forward to hear her. "I thought it was time, that you were old enough to understand. But your mother..." She trailed off, shaking her head slowly. "Your mother made me promise years ago that this would never come out. She said it would destroy the family." Jake and I exchanged glances. What would destroy the family? He asked, his voice tight with tension. What could be so terrible that it's worth keeping secret for generations? Grandma Rose looked at us both for a long moment, and I could see her internal struggle playing out across her weathered features. The key opens a trunk in the attic, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It contains documents, photographs, letters, proof of something that happened long before you were born. Something that changed the course of our entire family. She stood up slowly, her age showing more than I'd ever seen before. But if I show you, there's no going back. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. And it will change how you see everyone in this family, including yourselves. The weight of her words settled over us like a heavy blanket. I thought about my mother's fearful reaction to the key, about the way she'd begged me to put it away and forget about it. What could be so damaging that it would make a strong woman like my mother crumble at the mere mention of it? But the need to know had become an obsession, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied with half-truths and evasions. I need to see what's in that trunk, I said, standing up with more confidence than I felt. Whatever it is, it's been affecting our family for generations. Maybe it's time to bring it into the light. Jake nodded in agreement, though I could see the fear in his eyes. Grandma Rose studied us both for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, she nodded. Very well. But remember, I warned you. Some stones are better left unturned. She led us to the narrow staircase that led to the second floor, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The attic was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, and as we climbed up into the dusty, cobweb-filled space, I felt like we were ascending into another world entirely. The attic was larger than I'd expected, with slanted ceilings and small windows that let in just enough light to create an eerie, ethereal atmosphere. Old furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts throughout the space, and the air smelled of dust and old wood and something else I couldn't identify. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a collection of Christmas decorations and old suitcases, sat a large wooden trunk. It was beautiful in its own way, made of dark wood with brass fittings that had tarnished with age. But there was something ominous about it too, as if it had been waiting patiently for decades for someone to finally unlock its secrets. This is it, Grandma Rose said, her voice heavy with resignation. The trunk has been in our family for over a century. My grandmother showed it to me when I was your age, Emma, just as her grandmother had shown it to her. And now it's your turn to bear this burden. She gestured toward the old-fashioned lock on the front of the trunk, and I realized with a jolt that it was designed to fit the key in my hand. With trembling fingers, I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the attic, and I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the trunk was filled with papers, photographs, and what looked like official documents. But it was the photograph on top that made my blood run cold. It was a black and white image of a young woman who looked exactly like me. Not similar, exactly like me. She was wearing a 1920s-style dress and standing in front of what appeared to be a courthouse, but her face was unmistakably mine. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, I wondered if I was looking at some kind of time travel photograph of myself. That's your great-great-grandmother, Margaret, Grandma Rose said quietly. She was accused of murdering her husband in 1923. The trial made national headlines. Jake gasped beside me, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. She was acquitted, but not because she was innocent. She was acquitted because she was pregnant, and the jury couldn't bring themselves to send an expectant mother to the electric chair. I stared at the photograph, my mind reeling. Are you saying our family descends from a murderer? I whispered. But Grandma Rose shook her head slowly. I'm saying that Margaret was protecting her children from a violent, abusive man who had already killed her first baby. She did what she had to do to survive. But the scandal destroyed her reputation and forced the family to move across the country and change their name. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I thought I knew about our family history was a lie. We weren't the respectable, middle-class family I'd always believed we were. We were the descendants of a woman who had committed murder, regardless of her reasons. No wonder my mother had been so desperate to keep this secret. No wonder she'd been terrified when she learned about the key. As I continued to dig through the trunk, I found more disturbing evidence. Letters from Margaret to her sister, describing the abuse she'd suffered. Police reports that had been suppressed. Court documents that revealed the extensive corruption that had surrounded the trial. And photograph after photograph of Margaret, each one showing the same face that looked back at me from the mirror every morning. "This is why your mother was so angry when she found out I'd given you the key," Grandma Rose said, her voice filled with regret. She spent her entire life trying to escape this legacy, trying to build a normal family free from the shadow of Margaret's actions. When your father found out about this during their divorce proceedings, he threatened to use it against her in court. That's the real reason their marriage ended. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture so terrible I could barely comprehend it. Our family had been built on a foundation of violence and secrets, and that foundation was finally crumbling. I thought about my mother's desperate attempts to maintain control, about Jake's recent self-destructive behavior, about the way our family had been slowly disintegrating even before the divorce. We were all carrying the weight of Margaret's actions, whether we knew it or not. "There's more," Grandma Rose said quietly, reaching into the trunk and pulling out a thick manila envelope. "These are the medical records from Margaret's pregnancy. The child she was carrying when she was on trial, it wasn't her husband's baby. It was conceived during an affair she'd been having with the prosecuting attorney. He threw the case to protect his own reputation. The truth was more twisted and complicated than I could have imagined. Not only was our ancestor a murderer, but she had manipulated the justice system through blackmail and corruption. The very foundation of our family was built on lies, violence, and moral compromise." As I sat there in the dusty attic, surrounded by the evidence of our dark legacy, I realized that everything I'd believed about myself and my family was about to change forever. The silence in the attic was deafening as the full weight of Grandma Rose's revelations settled over us. I stared at the manila envelope in her hands, my mind struggling to process what she'd just told us. The prosecuting attorney had been Margaret's lover, and he'd deliberately thrown the case to protect both of them. Our entire family lineage was built on a foundation of murder, corruption, and lies that stretched back over a century. "I need some air," Jake said suddenly, his face pale and drawn. He stumbled toward the ladder, and I could hear him climbing down with unsteady steps. Part of me wanted to follow him, to escape from this suffocating attic and pretend we'd never opened that trunk. But another part of me, the part that had been awakened by the key, needed to know everything. "Why are you telling us this now?" I asked Grandma Rose, my voice barely steady. "Why didn't you take this secret to your grave like your grandmother probably expected you to?" She sat down heavily on an old wooden crate, suddenly looking every one of her 83 years. "Because I'm dying, Emma," she said simply, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "The doctors gave me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. I've been carrying this burden for 60 years, and I can't bear the thought of it dying with me. Your mother thinks that keeping secrets protects the family, but I've watched what those secrets have done to all of us. They've poisoned every relationship, every generation." I felt tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. The woman who had been my anchor, my source of unconditional love and stability, was dying. And she'd chosen to spend her final months unburdening herself of a secret that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my identity. "The key was never meant to be hidden away," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It was meant to be passed down as a reminder, not of shame, but of survival. Margaret wasn't a monster, Emma. She was a woman who did what she had to do to protect her children from a man who would have eventually killed them all. The corruption that followed, the lies and cover-ups, those weren't her choices. They were the choices of powerful men who wanted to control the narrative." I looked down at the photographs scattered around the open trunk, seeing Margaret's face, my face, in a completely different light. Instead of the cold-blooded killer I'd initially imagined, I began to see a desperate woman backed into a corner, fighting for her life and the lives of her children. The resemblance between us felt less like a curse and more like a connection across time. What happened to her after the trial? I asked, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. Grandma Rose reached into the trunk and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She wrote in this diary until the day she died, she said, handing it to me. She never remarried, never had another relationship. She devoted her life to raising her children and trying to build something good out of the terrible situation she'd been forced into. She worked as a seamstress, saved every penny, and eventually bought a small house where she could give her children a stable home. I opened the journal carefully, afraid the brittle pages might crumble in my hands. Margaret's handwriting was delicate and precise, each letter formed with careful attention to detail. The first entry I read was dated 3 months after the trial. The nightmares are getting worse. Not about what I did to Henry, I'll never regret protecting my children from that monster, but about what I've become. The lies I had to tell, the people I had to manipulate, the corruption I had to participate in just to survive. I pray every night that my children will never have to carry this burden, that they'll be able to live clean, honest lives free from the shadow of my actions. As I read more entries, a picture emerged of a woman tortured by guilt, not for the murder itself, but for the web of lies and corruption she'd been forced to navigate to escape punishment. She wrote about her fear that her children would one day discover the truth, about her desperate attempts to create a normal life for them, about the way she jumped at every knock on the door, terrified that someone would come to expose her. She loved us, I whispered, looking up at Grandma Rose. All of us, all the generations that came after her. She was trying to protect us. My grandmother nodded, tears streaming down her own cheeks. That's what I've been trying to tell your mother for years, she said. Margaret's story isn't one of shame, it's one of courage. She survived something that would have destroyed most people, and she built a legacy of strong women who weren't afraid to fight for what they believed in. But your mother has been so focused on hiding from that legacy that she's forgotten what it actually means. I thought about my mother's reaction to the key, her desperate plea for me to put it away and forget about it. I'd interpreted her response as fear of judgment, but now I realized it was something deeper. She was terrified of becoming like Margaret, of being forced into a corner where she'd have to make impossible choices. The divorce, her frantic attempts to maintain control over every aspect of her life, even her strained relationship with Grandma Rose, it all made sense now. We need to tell her, I said, closing the journal and looking at my grandmother. We need to tell her that we know, and that we're not ashamed of Margaret. We're proud of her. But Grandma Rose shook her head slowly. Your mother will never see it that way, Emma. She spent 40 years running from this truth, building walls to protect herself from it. If you confront her with it directly, she'll only build higher walls. The knowledge of what you've discovered today will eat away at her, but she'll never admit it. I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The key had unlocked more than just a trunk, it had unlocked a part of myself I'd never known existed. For the first time in my life, I understood where my stubborn streak came from, why I'd always been willing to fight for what I believed in even when it cost me. I was Margaret's descendant, and that wasn't something to be ashamed of. Then we'll have to find another way, I said, standing up and brushing the dust from my clothes. We'll have to show her that this secret doesn't have to define us. That we can choose to see Margaret's story as one of strength instead of shame. I looked around the attic, at the scattered contents of the trunk, at the evidence of a century of hidden truth. Help me understand all of this, I said to Grandma Rose. Help me learn Margaret's full story, not just the parts that were covered up or twisted by the courts. If I'm going to carry this legacy forward, I want to understand what it really means. She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we'd climbed into the attic. There's so much more to tell you, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. Stories that have been passed down through the women in our family, truths that were too dangerous to write down. But Emma, you have to understand, once you know everything, you'll be responsible for deciding what to do with this knowledge. You'll have to choose whether to continue hiding it or whether to finally bring it into the light. I thought about Jake, who had fled the attic rather than face the truth. I thought about my mother, who had spent her entire adult life running from it. I thought about the generations of women who had carried this secret, each one bearing the weight of Margaret's actions and the corruption that had followed. And I realized that the key hadn't just unlocked a trunk, it had unlocked a choice. I choose the light, I said, my voice steady and clear. I choose to honor Margaret's courage instead of hiding from it. I choose to break the cycle of shame and secrecy that has been poisoning our family for a century. As I spoke the words, I felt something shift inside me, as if a weight I'd been carrying my entire life had suddenly been lifted. Grandma Rose stood up slowly and pulled me into a fierce hug. "That's my girl," she whispered into my hair. "That's Margaret's great-great-granddaughter. You have her strength, Emma. You have her courage. And now you have her story. What you do with it is up to you." The drive home from Grandma Rose's house felt like traveling between two different worlds. In one world, I was Emma Thompson, marketing professional with a normal family and predictable problems. In the other, I was Emma Thompson, descendant of Margaret, carrying the weight of a century-old secret that had shaped every generation of my family. The key sat heavy in my pocket, no longer mysterious but loaded with terrible knowledge that I wasn't sure I was strong enough to bear. Jake was waiting for me in my apartment parking lot when I arrived, pacing back and forth beside his beat-up Honda Civic. His face was flushed, and I could tell he'd been crying. When he saw me, he rushed over, his eyes wild with a mixture of anger and desperation. "We have to put it back," he said without preamble. "We have to put everything back in that trunk and pretend this never happened. I can't live with this, Emma. I can't wake up every morning knowing that our family is built on murder and corruption." His hands were shaking as he grabbed my shoulders. "Do you understand what this means? What this could do to us if it ever got out?" I looked at my little brother, seeing the fear that had been eating away at him since our parents' divorce, the self-destructive behavior that suddenly made perfect sense. He'd inherited the family curse of carrying secrets, except he didn't even know what the secret was until today. The weight of it was crushing him. "Jake, sit down," I said gently, guiding him to the bench outside my building. "We need to talk about this. Running away isn't going to make it disappear." But he shook his head violently, pulling away from me. "You don't get it," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been having dreams about Margaret for months. Dreams where I'm her, where I'm the one holding the knife, where I can feel the blood on my hands. I thought I was going crazy, but now I know it's because this poison has been in our family all along. It's in our DNA, Emma. We're predisposed to violence." The words hit me like a slap. I thought about my own recent dreams, the ones where I'd been standing in courtrooms and running from shadows. I thought about the way I'd always been quick to anger, the way I'd sometimes felt capable of things that scared me. Was Jake right? Were we carrying more than just the secret of Margaret's actions? "That's not how genetics work," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "We're not doomed to repeat her mistakes just because we're related to her." Jake laughed bitterly, a sound that made my heart ache. "Aren't we? Look at our family, Emma. Really look at it. Mom's been manipulating and controlling everyone around her for years. Dad finally couldn't take it anymore and left. You've been single for 3 years because you can't trust anyone enough to let them get close. And me?" He gestured to himself with disgust. "I'm failing out of college, drinking too much, and pushing away everyone who tries to help me. We're all damaged, and now I know why." His words forced me to confront patterns I'd been avoiding. My mother's need for control had always seemed like a strength, but what if it was really a manifestation of the same desperation that had driven Margaret to murder? My own trust issues, my tendency to keep people at arm's length, were those protective mechanisms inherited from generations of women who'd learned that the world was dangerous? "Maybe you're right," I admitted quietly. "Maybe we are carrying some of Margaret's trauma. But that doesn't mean we're doomed, Jake. It means we need to understand it so we can break the cycle." But even as I said the words, I could feel doubt creeping in. What if the knowledge I'd gained in Grandma Rose's attic was too dangerous? What if some secrets were meant to stay buried? That evening, I called my mother, knowing I had to test the waters somehow. I couldn't tell her directly what I'd discovered, but I needed to understand how deep her fear ran. When she answered, her voice sounded strained, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Emma, please tell me you haven't been doing anything foolish with that key," she said before I could even say hello. "Please tell me you listened to what I said about putting it away." The desperation in her voice was palpable, and I realized that she'd been living in terror since our last conversation. "Mom, I need to ask you something," I said carefully. "Have you ever felt like our family was carrying some kind of burden? Like there was something in our history that was affecting all of us?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if she'd hung up. "Emma," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things about our family that you're better off not knowing. Things that would change how you see yourself, how you see all of us. I've spent my entire life trying to protect you and Jake from that knowledge." I could hear her crying softly. "Please don't make me relive it. Please don't make me watch my children go through what I went through when I found out." The pain in her voice was devastating. I realized that my mother hadn't just been keeping Margaret's secret, she'd been living with the trauma of discovering it herself, probably around my age. She'd made the choice to bury it, to build a life free from its influence, and now she was watching that choice unravel. "What if I told you that I think Margaret was brave?" I said softly. "What if I told you that I think she did what she had to do to protect her children?" The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me I'd crossed a line. "You found the trunk," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Oh God, Emma, what have you done? What has she done to you?" The anguish in her voice made my chest tighten with guilt. "You don't understand what you're playing with. You don't understand what this knowledge does to people." "Then help me understand," I pleaded. "Talk to me about it instead of making me figure it out alone." But I could hear her pulling away, rebuilding the walls that the key had threatened to tear down. "I can't," she said, her voice becoming cold and distant. "I won't relive that nightmare, and I won't watch you destroy yourself with it. If you want to dig up the past, you'll have to do it without me. But don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in shock. Within an hour, Jake was back at my door, this time accompanied by our father. Dad looked older than I'd seen him since the divorce, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like fear. When I let them in, they both stood awkwardly in my living room, as if they weren't sure they should be there. "Your mother called me," Dad said without preamble. "She's convinced that you and Jake have uncovered some kind of family secret that's going to destroy everyone. She's in a complete panic, Emma. I haven't seen her like this since." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Since when?" I pressed, sensing there was more to this story. Dad glanced at Jake, then back at me, clearly debating how much to reveal. "Since right before we got married," he said finally. "There was something she tried to tell me about her family history, something that made her so upset she could barely speak. I told her I didn't care about whatever it was, that the past didn't matter as long as we loved each other. But it's haunted our entire marriage, Emma. Every argument we've ever had has been influenced by some secret she's been carrying." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My parents' marriage hadn't failed because they grew apart, it had failed because my mother had been carrying the weight of Margaret's secret alone, unable to share it but unable to escape its influence. Every decision she'd made, every attempt to control her family and protect them from the truth, had slowly poisoned their relationship. "Dad," I said carefully, "what if I told you that the secret Mom's been carrying isn't her fault? That it's something that happened generations before she was even born?" He looked at me with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Would it matter?" he asked sadly. "The damage is already done, sweetheart. Your mother and I are finished, regardless of what the secret is. But I'm worried about what this knowledge is going to do to you and Jake. I'm worried that you're going to let it consume you the way it consumed her." I looked at my father and my brother, both of them afraid of a truth they didn't even fully understand, and I realized that the key had unlocked more than just family history. It had revealed the way secrets could spread like poison through generations, damaging people who had nothing to do with the original events. Margaret's actions in 1923 were still destroying lives in 2025, not because of what she'd done, but because of how we'd chosen to handle the knowledge of it. Maybe Mom was right, I said slowly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Maybe some things are better left buried. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The secret had been destroying my family for decades precisely because it had been buried. The question was whether bringing it into the light would heal us or finish tearing us apart. 2 weeks after my conversation with my mother, I received a call that shattered what remained of my carefully constructed world. It was my father, his voice tight with panic as he told me that Jake had been hospitalized after what the doctors were calling a psychotic break. He'd been found in his apartment at 3 a.m, destroying everything he owned while screaming about blood on his hands and voices telling him to confess to crimes he'd never committed. I drove to the hospital in a state of numb shock, the key burning in my pocket like a brand of guilt. The psychiatric ward was a sterile, fluorescent-lit nightmare where my little brother sat strapped to a bed, his eyes vacant and unfocused. When he saw me, he began to sob uncontrollably, reaching for me with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Emma, I can see her," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I can see Margaret standing behind you. She's covered in blood, and she's trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what she's saying. Make her go away, please. I can't take it anymore." The attending psychiatrist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, pulled me aside to explain that Jake was experiencing severe dissociative episodes triggered by what appeared to be extreme psychological trauma. "Has your brother experienced any recent stressors?" she asked, her pen poised over his chart. "Any traumatic revelations or family conflicts that might have triggered this episode?" I stared at her, knowing that the truth would sound insane but also knowing that lying wouldn't help Jake get better. "We recently discovered some disturbing information about our family history," I said carefully. "Information that challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves." The psychiatrist nodded sympathetically, making notes as I spoke. "Family secrets can be incredibly damaging, especially when they surface suddenly," she said. "Your brother's mind is trying to process information that conflicts with his core identity. The hallucinations about this Margaret person suggest that he's internalizing guilt and trauma that don't actually belong to him." She looked at me with concern. "I have to ask, are you experiencing any similar symptoms? Intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, feelings of inherited guilt?" The question hit me like a physical blow because the answer was yes. I had been experiencing all of those things, along with an increasing sense that I was losing my grip on reality. The dreams about Margaret had become more vivid and frequent, and sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I could swear I saw her face instead of my own. But I couldn't admit that to the psychiatrist, not when Jake was already falling apart. "I'm fine," I lied, but she gave me a look that suggested she didn't believe me. "How long will he have to stay here?" She consulted his chart again, her expression grave. "That depends on how quickly he responds to treatment. We're going to start him on medication to help with the hallucinations, and he'll need intensive therapy to work through the trauma. But I have to be honest with you, cases like this can take months or even years to resolve fully." The words hit me like a death sentence. My brother, who had always been my closest ally, might never fully recover from the knowledge I'd forced on him. When I left the hospital, I drove straight to Grandma Rose's house, my hands shaking with rage and grief. I found her in her garden, tending to the roses that had always been her pride and joy. She looked up when she heard my car door slam, and the expression on her face told me she already knew why I was there. "He's in the hospital," I said without preamble, my voice sharp with accusation. "Jake is having a complete mental breakdown because of what you told us. He's seeing things, hearing voices, and the doctors don't know if he'll ever be the same." Grandma Rose's face went pale, and she slowly stood up, her gardening gloves falling to the ground. "Oh my dear God," she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. I never imagined it would affect him so severely. When I was his age and learned the truth, I was upset, but I was able to process it. I thought he would be strong enough. She trailed off, looking every one of her 83 years. You thought wrong, I said harshly, the words cutting through the afternoon air like knives. You were so focused on unburdening yourself before you die that you didn't consider what it would do to us. Jake may never recover from this, and it's your fault. The accusations poured out of me like poison, years of love and trust curdling into blame and resentment. Grandma Rose began to cry, silent tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said, her voice barely audible. I thought the truth would set us free, that keeping secrets was what was poisoning our family. But maybe your mother was right. Maybe some truths are too dangerous to share. It's too late for maybe, I snapped, though seeing her distress was already making me regret my harsh words. The damage is done. Jake is broken, Mom won't speak to any of us, and our family is destroyed. All because you couldn't take your secret to the grave like you were supposed to. But even as I said it, I knew I was being unfair. I had chosen to open that trunk. I had chosen to learn Margaret's story. The responsibility wasn't entirely hers. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the key that had started this nightmare. For the first time since Grandma Rose had given it to me, I seriously considered throwing it away, burying it somewhere where no future generation would ever find it. Jake's words from weeks earlier echoed in my mind, we have to put it back. We have to put everything back in that trunk and pretend this never happened. But it was too late for that now. The knowledge was out, spreading through our family like a virus, and there was no way to contain it. I thought about my mother, alone in her house, probably drinking wine and trying to convince herself that her children's lives weren't falling apart because of a secret she'd tried so hard to protect them from. I thought about my father, caught in the middle of a crisis he didn't understand, watching his ex-wife and children destroy themselves over something that had happened before any of us were born. My phone rang, startling me out of my dark thoughts. It was my mother, and when I answered, I could immediately tell she'd been drinking. This is all my fault, she slurred into the phone. I should have told you years ago, when you were old enough to handle it. I should have controlled how you learned about it instead of letting her spring it on you like that. She was crying, her words barely comprehensible through her tears. Jake called me from the hospital. He told me what he's been seeing, what he's been experiencing. My baby is losing his mind because I was too much of a coward to face the truth. Mom, where are you? I asked, suddenly terrified that she might do something desperate. Are you at home? Are you safe? But she didn't answer my questions, continuing to ramble about guilt and responsibility and the ways she'd failed as a mother. I've been thinking about Margaret a lot lately, she said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that scared me. About how she made the hard choice, the choice that saved her children even though it damned her. Maybe it's time for me to make a hard choice too. Maybe it's time for me to remove myself from the equation so the rest of you can heal. The words sent ice through my veins. Mom, don't talk like that. Don't even think like that. I'm coming over right now, and we're going to figure this out together. I was already grabbing my keys, my mind racing with panic. Had I destroyed my family so completely that my mother was contemplating suicide? You know what the worst part is? She continued, as if she hadn't heard me. Margaret was brave. She did what she had to do to protect her children from a monster. But I've been a coward my whole life. I've been running from her legacy instead of embracing it. And now my children are paying the price for my cowardice. I drove to my mother's house faster than I'd ever driven in my life, my heart pounding with terror. When I arrived, I found her sitting on her front porch in her pajamas, an empty wine bottle beside her chair. She looked up when she saw me, and I was shocked by how much she'd aged in the 2 weeks since our last conversation. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and she looked like she'd lost 15 pounds. You came, she said with surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to care enough to respond to her call. I thought you hated me for keeping the secret. I thought you blamed me for Jake's breakdown. I sat down beside her on the porch steps, my anger dissolving into overwhelming sadness. "I don't hate you, Mom," I said quietly. "I'm angry and confused and scared, but I don't hate you. We're all just trying to figure out how to live with this knowledge, and none of us knows what we're doing." She leaned against me then, and I could feel how fragile she'd become, as if the weight of Margaret's secret had been physically crushing her. "I used to dream about her too," she whispered. "When I was your age and first learned the truth. I would dream that I was her, standing over Henry's body with the knife in my hand. I would wake up feeling like I had actually committed murder, like I was guilty of something I'd never done. That's why I couldn't tell your father the whole truth when we got married. I was terrified that if he knew what kind of family he was marrying into, he'd see me as a potential killer too." The confession broke my heart. My mother had been carrying this burden alone for over 40 years, letting it poison her relationships and her sense of self. No wonder she'd been so controlling, so desperate to maintain a perfect facade. She'd been running from Margaret's shadow her entire life. "Mom, we need to get help," I said gently. "Professional help. All of us. We can't handle this alone anymore." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but maybe we could learn to live with the truth in a healthier way. But as we sat there on her porch in the growing darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all standing on the edge of an abyss, and one wrong move would send us all tumbling into the void. The key had unlocked more than just Margaret's story, it had unlocked a family's capacity for self-destruction, and I wasn't sure any of us were strong enough to pull back from the brink. The family therapy session Dr. Martinez had arranged felt like stepping into a courtroom where we were all simultaneously the accused and the accusers. The neutral beige walls of her office seemed to absorb our collective pain as we sat in an awkward circle, me, my mother, my father, and an empty chair that represented Jake, who was still too fragile to leave the psychiatric facility. Grandma Rose had insisted on coming, despite her failing health, saying she owed it to all of us to face the consequences of her decision to reveal the family secret. "I want to start by acknowledging how much courage it took for all of you to come here together," Dr. Martinez said, her calm voice cutting through the tension that hung in the air like smoke. "Generational trauma is one of the most complex issues families can face, and secrets that span multiple generations create wounds that can seem impossible to heal." My mother sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She hadn't spoken to Grandma Rose directly since learning that she'd shown us the trunk, and the silence between them felt like a physical barrier. Dad kept glancing between them, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of a conflict he still didn't fully understand. "Before we can move forward," Dr. Martinez continued, "we need everyone to share their perspective on what's happened. Not to assign blame, but to understand how each of you has been affected by this revelation." She looked at my mother first. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like to start?" Mom's response was immediate and sharp. "I've spent 43 years protecting my children from the truth about Margaret, and in one afternoon, that protection was stripped away. My son is in a psychiatric ward, my daughter is carrying trauma that doesn't belong to her, and my family is destroyed. All because someone couldn't keep a secret that was never hers to tell." The accusation hung in the air like a blade, and I saw Grandma Rose flinch as if she'd been physically struck. But instead of defending herself, my grandmother nodded slowly. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a selfish decision based on my own fear of dying with this burden. I convinced myself that the truth would set us free, but I didn't consider the cost. I'm sorry, Linda. I'm sorry to all of you." The simple admission seemed to deflate some of my mother's anger, and I saw her shoulders relax slightly. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly before turning to me. "Emma, how has learning about Margaret affected you?" she asked. I thought about the dreams, the way I'd been seeing Margaret's face in mirrors, the growing sense that I was carrying someone else's guilt. At first, I thought I was honoring her memory by refusing to be ashamed of what she did, I said slowly. I thought I was being brave by choosing to face the truth instead of hiding from it. But seeing what it's done to Jake, seeing how it's torn our family apart, I don't know if I was brave or just naive. Maybe some truths are too heavy for any one person to carry. Dad cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I keep thinking about all the times your mother would withdraw from me, all the fights we had where it felt like she was arguing with someone who wasn't in the room. Now I understand that she was fighting with Margaret's ghost, with a legacy she couldn't escape. If I'd known what she was carrying, maybe I could have helped her carry it. But that's exactly why I couldn't tell you, Mom said, turning to him with tears in her eyes. I was terrified that if you knew the truth about my family, you'd see me differently. You'd wonder if I was capable of the same violence, if I might pass that potential on to our children. I thought I was protecting all of you by keeping it secret. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Linda, what you're describing is a very common response to generational trauma. When we carry shame that doesn't belong to us, we often isolate ourselves rather than risk being judged. But isolation perpetuates the cycle. The shame grows stronger in darkness. Over the following weeks, I found myself making regular visits to both the therapist's office and the psychiatric facility where Jake was slowly beginning to heal. The doctors had adjusted his medication, and the hallucinations were becoming less frequent, but he was still fragile, still jumping at shadows that might or might not be there. I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said about inherited trauma, he told me during one visit, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. About how we can carry wounds that aren't ours. Maybe that's what's been wrong with me all along, not just since we learned about Margaret, but for years. Maybe I've been feeling her pain without understanding why. I nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. I think we all have been. Moms need to control everything, my trust issues, your self-destructive behavior, maybe we've all been responding to trauma that happened a century ago. But here's what I don't understand, Jake continued, his brow furrowed in concentration. If Margaret did what she had to do to protect her children, why are we treating her story like a curse? Why can't we treat it like what it really was, a woman who refused to let her children be destroyed by a violent man? His words sparked something in my mind, a shift in perspective that I'd been struggling toward but hadn't been able to articulate. Margaret hadn't been a villain, she'd been a survivor. And maybe instead of carrying her story as shame, we could carry it as strength. That evening, I visited Grandma Rose, who had been growing weaker by the day. I found her in her living room, the same room where she'd first given me the key, surrounded by photo albums and documents she'd been organizing. I've been thinking about what you said to Dr. Martinez, I told her, settling into the chair beside her. About how you convinced yourself that the truth would set us free. Maybe you weren't wrong, maybe we just haven't figured out how to be free yet. She looked up from the photo album in her lap, her eyes brightening slightly. What do you mean, dear? I mean, maybe the problem isn't Margaret's story itself, but how we've been carrying it. Maybe instead of treating it like a family curse, we need to treat it like family history, complicated and painful, but ours nonetheless. Grandma Rose smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. You're starting to sound like Margaret herself. She wrote about that in her diary, about refusing to let shame define her children's futures. She said that survival wasn't something to be ashamed of, even when the methods weren't pretty. Over the next few sessions with Dr. Martinez, we began to work on reframing Margaret's story. Instead of focusing on the violence of her actions, we explored the context, an abused woman in the 1920s with no legal protections, no support systems, and no options for escape except the one she created for herself. What if we looked at Margaret as the first woman in your family line to refuse to be a victim? Dr. Martinez suggested during one session. What if her legacy isn't violence, but the courage to protect what matters most, even when the cost is enormous? My mother, who had been slowly opening up over the weeks, looked thoughtful. I never thought about it that way, she admitted. I've always focused on what she did, not why she did it. But you're right, she saved her children. Whatever else happened, she saved them. And every generation since then has benefited from her courage, I added, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. We exist because she refused to let a violent man destroy her family. Maybe instead of carrying shame about her methods, we should be carrying gratitude for her sacrifice. The breakthrough came during a session where Dr. Martinez asked us to imagine having a conversation with Margaret herself. What would we want to tell her? What would we want to ask her? I would want to thank her, my mother said quietly, tears streaming down her face. I would want to tell her that her sacrifice mattered, that her children lived good lives because of what she did. And I would want to apologize for being ashamed of her for so long. Grandma Rose nodded, her own eyes wet. I would want to tell her that her great-great-granddaughter has her strength and her courage. That the family line she fought to protect has produced strong women who aren't afraid to face hard truths. When it was my turn, I thought about the dreams I'd been having, about the way Margaret's face had been haunting my mirrors. I would want to tell her that I understand now. That I see her not as a killer, but as a protector. And I would want to promise her that I'll make sure future generations know the truth about what she did and why she did it. As we left the therapy session that day, I felt something shifting in our family dynamic. The secret that had been poisoning us for generations was finally being exposed to light and air, and instead of destroying us, it was beginning to heal us. We were learning to carry Margaret's story not as shame, but as a reminder of what women in our family were capable of when protecting the people we loved. That night, I called Jake at the hospital to tell him about the session. His voice was stronger than it had been in weeks, and when I described our new understanding of Margaret's legacy, he was quiet for a long time. You know what's funny, he said finally. I haven't had any nightmares about her in 3 days. It's like she was trying to tell me something all along, but I was too afraid to listen. Maybe she wasn't haunting me, maybe she was trying to help me understand. For the first time since I'd inserted that key into the trunk's lock, I felt genuinely hopeful about our family's future. We had a long way to go, and Jake's recovery would take time, but we were finally moving in the right direction. We were learning to honor Margaret's memory instead of hiding from it, and in doing so, we were beginning to heal wounds that had been festering for a century. The call came at 2 a.m, 3 weeks after our last family therapy session. It was the nurse from Grandma Rose's assisted living facility, her voice gentle but urgent as she explained that my grandmother had taken a turn for the worse. She's asking for you specifically, the nurse said. She says there's something she needs to tell you before it's too late. I drove through the empty streets with my heart pounding, knowing that this might be my last chance to speak with the woman who had shaped so much of my understanding of family and love. When I arrived at the facility, I found Grandma Rose propped up in her bed, looking impossibly small and fragile in the dim light of her room. But her eyes were alert, and when she saw me, she managed a weak smile. "Emma, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so glad you came. There's something I haven't told you about Margaret, something I've been too afraid to share even with the therapist." She reached for my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones. "But I can't die with this last secret. You need to know the whole truth." I settled into the chair beside her bed, my mind racing with possibilities. What could be worse than what we'd already learned? What final revelation could she have been holding back? "Tell me, Grandma," I said softly. "Whatever it is, I can handle it." She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. The man Margaret killed, Henry, he wasn't just abusive. He had already killed her first child, a little girl named Rose, my namesake. He threw the baby down the stairs during one of his rages, and when she died, he convinced everyone it was an accident. Margaret knew better, but she had no proof, no way to make anyone believe her. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought I had understood the full scope of Margaret's story, but this revelation changed everything. She hadn't just been protecting future children, she'd been avenging a child who had already been murdered. "That's why she couldn't let him live," Grandma Rose continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew that if she stayed, if she tried to leave, he would hunt her down and kill her remaining children too. The murder wasn't just about survival, it was about justice for a baby who never got to grow up. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a settling of understanding that went deeper than anything I'd experienced before. Margaret hadn't been driven by anger or desperation alone, she'd been driven by a mother's love for a child who had been stolen from her, and by her determination to prevent other children from suffering the same fate. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. Grandma Rose smiled sadly. Because I was afraid it would make you see her as a vigilante instead of a victim. I was afraid you'd think she was motivated by revenge rather than protection. But the truth is, it was both. She was protecting her living children and honoring her dead one. And maybe that's what real justice looks like sometimes, not what the courts can provide, but what a mother's love demands. The next morning, I called my mother and asked her to meet me at Grandma Rose's house. I had made a decision during the long night at the hospital, and I needed her to be part of it. When she arrived, she looked hesitant and uncertain, as if she expected another painful revelation that would shatter the fragile progress we'd made. I want to go through Margaret's things again, I told her, leading her to the attic. All of them. Not just the documents and photographs, but her personal belongings, her diary entries, everything. I want to understand her completely, not just the parts that were preserved for history. My mother looked at me with confusion. Why? What's changed? I told her about Grandma Rose's final revelation, about the murdered child who had been Margaret's first daughter. As I spoke, I watched my mother's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like awe. She wasn't just protecting her children, Mom whispered. She was honoring one who had already been lost. Oh God, Emma, what that poor woman must have endured. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, my mother looked at Margaret's story with something approaching admiration rather than shame. We spent the entire day in that attic, going through every box and trunk, reading every document and letter. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been far more complex and remarkable than any of us had realized. Margaret had not only survived her husband's murder trial, but had gone on to become an advocate for other abused women. She had used her sewing skills to provide employment for women who needed to escape violent situations, and she had quietly funded safe houses and legal assistance for those who couldn't afford it. Look at this, my mother said, holding up a letter dated 15 years after the trial. It's from a woman named Catherine, thanking Margaret for helping her escape from her husband. She says Margaret saved her life and the lives of her 3 children. We found dozens of similar letters, testimonials from women who had found refuge and support through Margaret's network. She turned her tragedy into a mission, I said, feeling a deep sense of pride and connection to this woman I'd never met. She used what she learned from her own suffering to help others. That's not the legacy of a killer, that's the legacy of a hero. As the sun began to set, my mother and I sat surrounded by the evidence of Margaret's true legacy. The key that had started this entire journey lay between us, no longer a symbol of dark secrets but a testament to the courage and compassion that had been passed down through our family line. I owe you an apology, my mother said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. Not just for keeping this secret, but for teaching you to be ashamed of who we come from. Margaret wasn't a stain on our family history, she was its greatest triumph. And I've spent 40 years running from the very strength that made us who we are. Mom, I said, reaching for her hand, you were protecting us the only way you knew how. You carried this burden alone for decades so that Jake and I could grow up without the weight of it. That took its own kind of courage. She squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my real mother instead of someone hiding behind walls of fear and shame. What do we do now? She asked. How do we honor Margaret's memory properly? How do we make sure her real story is told? I looked around the attic, at the evidence of a life lived with purpose and courage, and I knew what needed to happen. We tell the truth, I said. All of it. Not just the murder, but the context. Not just the violence, but the love and protection and justice that motivated it. We make sure that future generations understand that Margaret wasn't a family embarrassment, she was a family hero. That evening, I visited Jake at the hospital, where he was preparing for his discharge the following week. He looked healthier than he had in months, his eyes clear and focused, his hands steady. When I told him about the day's discoveries, about Margaret's advocacy work and the lives she'd saved, he listened with growing amazement. So all this time, we've been carrying shame about a woman who spent her life helping others? He asked. We've been treating her like a family curse when she was actually a family blessing? I nodded, and he shook his head in wonder. No wonder I was having nightmares. My subconscious knew we were getting the story wrong. Jake, I want to ask you something, I said, settling into the visitor's chair. When you get out of here, would you be willing to help me write Margaret's real story? Not the version that's been whispered about for generations, but the complete truth about who she was and what she accomplished. His face lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm I'd seen from him since before our parents' divorce. Are you kidding? Of course I will. Someone needs to set the record straight. Someone needs to make sure people understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is also the most difficult thing. He paused, his expression growing serious. But Emma, are you sure you're ready for what that might mean? If we tell Margaret's story publicly, there's no taking it back. Our family will always be associated with it. Good, I said firmly. I want our family to be associated with courage and justice and protection of the innocent. I want people to know that we come from a line of women who don't back down when someone they love is threatened. That's not something to hide from, that's something to be proud of. As I drove home that night, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with my father, about how to include him in this new understanding of our family identity. I thought about the book Jake and I would write together, about the way Margaret's true legacy would finally be brought into the light. And I thought about Grandma Rose, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, who had given me the greatest gift possible, not just the key to a trunk, but the key to understanding who I really was. The next morning brought a call from the hospital. Grandma Rose had passed away peacefully in her sleep, with a smile on her face and Margaret's key clutched in her hand. As I grieved for the woman who had been my anchor and my guide, I also felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had trusted me with the family's most precious secret, and I was finally ready to prove myself worthy of that trust. Grandma Rose's funeral was unlike any I had ever attended. Instead of the somber affair I had expected, it became a celebration of truth, courage, and the healing power of shared understanding. Jake had been released from the hospital just 2 days before, and though he was still fragile, he insisted on being there to honor the woman who had trusted us with the family's greatest secret. As we gathered in the small chapel, I noticed something remarkable happening. The extended family members who had always seemed distant and mysterious suddenly made sense to me. Aunt Helen, who had never married and devoted her life to social work, carried herself with the same determined strength I now recognized as Margaret's legacy. Cousin Sarah, who had survived an abusive marriage and now ran a women's shelter, had the same fierce protectiveness in her eyes that I'd seen in Margaret's photographs. During the service, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share memories of Rose, I stood up and walked to the podium. My hands were shaking as I looked out at the faces of my family, but my voice was steady when I began to speak. Grandma Rose gave me a gift in her final months, I said, pulling the antique key from my pocket and holding it up for everyone to see. This key unlocked more than just an old trunk, it unlocked the truth about who we are and where we come from. And I think it's time that truth was shared with all of you. I told Margaret's complete story, from the abuse she had suffered to the murder of her first child, from her desperate act of protection to her lifelong mission of helping other women escape violence. I watched as faces around the room shifted from shock to understanding to something that looked like pride. When I finished, the chapel was silent for a long moment. Then Aunt Helen stood up. I always wondered why my grandmother had such fire in her eyes when she talked about protecting family, she said, her voice carrying across the room. Now I understand. We carry Margaret's strength in our blood, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. One by one, other family members began to share their own stories, patterns of courage and protection that suddenly made sense in the context of Margaret's legacy. After the service, my parents approached me together. It was the first time I'd seen them stand side by side since the divorce, and there was something different about their body language, not reconciliation exactly, but a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," my father said quietly, "for helping me understand what your mother has been carrying all these years. I wish I had known sooner. I wish I could have helped her carry it." My mother looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You couldn't have helped because I wouldn't let you," she said. I was so afraid that knowing about Margaret would change how you saw me, how you saw our children. But keeping that secret changed me anyway, and not for the better. She turned to me. Emma, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You did what I never had the courage to do, you faced the truth and found a way to transform it into something beautiful. Jake joined us, looking healthier and more grounded than he had in months. I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said about inherited trauma, he said. About how it can be passed down through generations unconsciously. But what if the opposite is also true? What if we can consciously pass down inherited strength instead? His words sparked something in my mind, a vision of the future that was suddenly crystal clear. That's exactly what we're going to do, I said. We're going to make sure that every generation after us knows Margaret's real story. Not as a shameful secret, but as a source of strength and inspiration. Over the following weeks, Jake and I threw ourselves into researching and writing Margaret's biography. We spent countless hours in libraries and historical archives, tracking down court records and newspaper accounts that had been buried for decades. What we discovered was even more remarkable than we had imagined. Margaret's network of support for abused women had been extensive and sophisticated, operating through churches, women's clubs, and informal networks that spanned multiple states. She had helped establish some of the first domestic violence shelters in the country, though her name had been kept out of the official records to protect her from potential legal repercussions. The women she had saved went on to save others, creating a ripple effect of protection and healing that continued long after Margaret's death. She wasn't just a survivor, Jake said one evening as we worked on a particularly difficult chapter about the corruption surrounding her trial. She was a revolutionary. She refused to accept that women and children should suffer in silence, and she did something about it. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into my bones. And she did it all while carrying the trauma of losing her first child, I added. She could have let that tragedy destroy her, but instead she used it to fuel her mission to protect other children. As I wrote those words, I felt Margaret's presence in a way I never had before, not as a ghost or a source of guilt, but as a guide and inspiration. The book took 6 months to complete, and during that time, our family continued to heal in ways that seemed almost miraculous. My parents began attending couples therapy, not to reconcile their marriage but to heal the wounds that Margaret's secret had created in their relationship. They realized that while they couldn't rebuild their romantic connection, they could rebuild their friendship and their partnership as parents. My mother started volunteering at a local women's shelter, using her business skills to help with fundraising and administration. I spent so many years running from Margaret's legacy, she told me one day. Now I want to honor it. I want to continue the work she started. Watching her find purpose and healing in this way filled me with a pride I had never experienced before. Jake returned to college with a new major, social work with a focus on trauma therapy. His experience with inherited trauma had given him insights that his professors found remarkable, and he was already being courted by graduate programs that specialized in generational healing. I want to help other families learn what we've learned, he told me. I want to help them transform their inherited pain into inherited strength. As for me, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. The trust issues that had plagued my relationships began to dissolve as I understood that my ancestors' story was one of love and protection, not betrayal and violence. I started dating again, and for the first time in years, I felt capable of the kind of deep emotional connection that had always terrified me before. The most profound change, however, was in my relationship with myself. The face that looked back at me from the mirror was no longer Margaret's ghost, it was my own face, shaped by her legacy but not defined by her choices. I carried her strength and courage, but I also carried the healing and growth that 3 generations of women had built upon her foundation. On the anniversary of the day Grandma Rose had given me the key, our family gathered again, not for a funeral this time, but for a celebration. We met at the old house, which my mother had decided to keep as a family heritage site. In the living room where it all began, we toasted Margaret's memory with wine and shared stories about how her legacy was continuing to unfold in our lives. To Margaret, my father said, raising his glass with a warmth I had never heard in his voice before. A woman we never met but who shaped every one of us. May her courage live on in her descendants. As we drank, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with new beginnings. That night, I sat alone in Grandma Rose's old chair, holding the key that had started this incredible journey. Tomorrow, Jake and I would submit our manuscript to publishers, and Margaret's real story would finally be told to the world. But tonight, I simply sat in gratitude for the gift I had been given, not just the key itself, but the understanding that some secrets are meant to be unlocked, some truths are meant to be shared, and some legacies are meant to be celebrated rather than hidden. The key was warm in my palm, no longer a burden or a mystery but a symbol of the courage it takes to face difficult truths and transform them into sources of strength. As I prepared to pass this legacy on to future generations, I knew that Margaret's story, our story, was far from over. It was just beginning to be told the way it always should have been, with pride, with love, and with the understanding that sometimes the most important doors we unlock are the ones within ourselves. 5 years later, I stood in the same living room where Grandma Rose had first placed the key in my palm, but everything had changed. The house had been transformed into the Margaret Rose Foundation headquarters, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and helping families heal from generational trauma. The walls that had once held family secrets now displayed photographs of the hundreds of women and children whose lives had been touched by Margaret's legacy. Jake stood beside me, no longer the broken young man who had fled from truth and terror, but a confident therapist whose groundbreaking work on inherited trauma had earned him recognition from institutions across the country. His doctoral dissertation on transforming family secrets into family strength had become required reading in social work programs, and he regularly spoke at conferences about the healing power of confronting difficult truths. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, adjusting his tie as we prepared for the book launch celebration. Our biography of Margaret, titled The Key to Courage, One Woman's Fight for Justice and the Legacy She Left Behind, had spent 12 weeks on the bestseller list and was being translated into 7 languages. More importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about domestic violence, historical injustice, and the courage required to break cycles of abuse. "I think Margaret's ready," I replied, touching the key that I now wore as a necklace, no longer hidden in my pocket, but displayed as a symbol of pride and remembrance. "I think she's been waiting over a century for her real story to be told." The living room filled with faces that had become precious to me over the years. My parents were there, sitting together not as a reunited couple but as friends who had learned to honor their shared history while building separate but healthy lives. Dad had remarried a kind woman named Carol who understood and respected the complexity of our family's story, while Mom had found fulfillment in her work with the foundation and a gentle romance with a fellow volunteer named David. Dr. Martinez was there too, along with several of the families she had helped heal from their own generational traumas. She had become a close friend and advisor to the foundation, developing therapeutic protocols specifically designed to help families transform inherited shame into inherited strength. But the guests who moved me most were the unexpected ones, descendants of other women Margaret had helped, who had discovered their own family connections through our book. Catherine's great-granddaughter had driven from Oregon to thank us for helping her understand why her family had always carried such fierce protectiveness for vulnerable women. The granddaughter of another woman Margaret had sheltered had started her own domestic violence program in Chicago, inspired by learning about her family's connection to our ancestor. As I looked around the room, I realized that Margaret's true legacy wasn't just our family, it was an entire network of descendants who carried her courage and compassion without even knowing where it had come from. "Before we begin the official celebration," I said, calling for everyone's attention, "I want to share something that happened this morning." I pulled out a letter that had arrived in the mail, postmarked from a small town in Montana. "This is from a woman named Jennifer, whose daughter was killed by her abusive ex-husband last year. She read our book and wanted us to know that understanding Margaret's story helped her find the courage to testify against him in court. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison." The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over everyone. This was why we had undertaken this journey, not just to heal our own family, but to help others find the strength to protect themselves and their children. "Jennifer wants to start a scholarship fund in Margaret's name," I continued, my voice thick with emotion, "to help other women escape dangerous situations. She says that knowing about Margaret made her feel less alone, like she was part of a long line of women who refused to be victims." Jake stepped forward, pulling out his own letter. And this one came yesterday from a therapist in Minneapolis who's been using our book with clients who struggle with family shame. She says that Margaret's story has helped dozens of people reframe their understanding of inherited trauma and find paths to healing. As more and more people shared their own stories about how Margaret's legacy had touched their lives, I felt a presence in the room that was almost tangible. Not the tormented ghost that had haunted our dreams, but the spirit of a woman whose love and courage had rippled across a century to touch lives she never could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a text message, and when I looked at it, I had to blink back tears. It was from Sarah, the shelter director who is also our cousin, sending a photo from a domestic violence conference in Washington, D.C. The caption read, "Margaret's great-great-granddaughters presenting legislation for enhanced domestic violence protections. She would be so proud." As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, I found myself alone with the key for the first time in months. I thought about that afternoon 5 years ago when I had driven home from Grandma Rose's house, confused and frightened by the mystery I'd been given. I could never have imagined then that this small piece of metal would unlock not just Margaret's story, but the stories of countless other women who had found strength in her example. Jake joined me as I stood looking at the portrait of Margaret that now hung prominently in what had once been Grandma Rose's living room. In the painting, commissioned from one of her original photographs, Margaret's eyes held the same determination and love that I saw in my own reflection now. "Do you think she knew?" Jake asked softly. "When she made the choice to kill Henry, do you think she had any idea what her courage would lead to?" I considered the question, thinking about the diary entries we'd read, the letters from women she'd helped, the careful way she'd preserved evidence of her husband's abuse. "I think she hoped," I said finally. "I think she hoped that her children and her children's children would be strong enough to carry her legacy forward. And I think she hoped that someday, women wouldn't have to make the impossible choices she was forced to make." As we prepared to leave the house that night, I did something I had done every time I visited for the past 5 years. I walked to the window where Margaret's key had first caught the light and placed my hand on the glass, sending a silent message across time. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for your courage, thank you for your sacrifice, and thank you for trusting us with your story. We won't let it be forgotten." In the months that followed, the Margaret Rose Foundation continued to grow, but its most important work happened in the quiet moments, when a terrified woman called our hotline and found the courage to leave an abusive partner, when a family learned to transform their inherited shame into inherited wisdom, when a child grew up knowing that they came from a line of protectors and survivors. The key that had once unlocked a trunk of secrets had become something far more powerful, a symbol that unlocked hearts, minds, and futures. It reminded us that some doors are meant to be opened, some truths are meant to be shared, and some legacies are meant to shine in the light rather than hide in the darkness. 1 year later, I stood at the altar of a small chapel, wearing my great-great-grandmother's key as my something old, preparing to marry a man who understood that loving me meant loving all of who I was, including the complicated history that had shaped me. Jake stood as my best man, healthy and whole and proud to be Margaret's descendant. My parents sat together in the front row, not as husband and wife but as family, united in their love for their children and their commitment to honoring the woman whose courage had made our healing possible. As I exchanged vows with David, promising to build a future based on truth and trust and the kind of love that protects rather than controls, I felt Margaret's presence like a blessing. The key around my neck caught the light streaming through the chapel windows, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw her smile. Later, as my new husband and I posed for photographs, the photographer asked about the unusual necklace I was wearing. "It's a family heirloom," I said, touching the key gently. "It represents the courage it takes to unlock the truth, even when that truth is difficult to bear." "That's beautiful," she said, snapping another photo. "I love that it's not hidden away but displayed so prominently. Family treasures should be celebrated, don't you think?" "Yes," I agreed, thinking of all the women who had come before me and all the women who would come after. Family treasures should definitely be celebrated. As the sun set on what had been the most perfect day of my life, I made a silent promise to the future generations who would one day inherit Margaret's key. They would know her story not as a shameful secret but as a source of strength. They would understand that they came from a line of women who chose love over fear, protection over silence, and courage over compliance. And someday, when the time was right, one of them would hold this key in their palm and feel the same spark of recognition I had felt 5 years ago, not the burden of inherited shame, but the gift of inherited courage, passed down with love from one generation of strong women to the next. The key had unlocked more than doors, it had unlocked the truth that family legacy isn't about perfection, but about the courage to face imperfection with love, the wisdom to transform pain into purpose, and the strength to ensure that the next generation inherits not just our struggles, but our triumphs as well. In the end, Grandma Rose had been right. The key wasn't meant for any physical door, it was meant to unlock understanding, healing, and the kind of love that transcends time itself. And as I looked toward a future filled with possibilities I could never have imagined before Margaret's story came to light, I knew that the most important doors were still waiting to be opened.